But Aurelian managed to smash his way out of the trap, rather than falling by the wayside like Decius and Aemilianus and Gallus before him. The northern tribes would take advantage of his withdrawal back to Italy, but they would come to regret it. Quintillus gathered his troops at Aquileia in preparation for the assumed invasion of Aurelian, but as they met and readied themselves, it became obvious quickly that this was starting to look an awful lot like a suicide mission. Eventually, the Danube legions, under the command of Aurelian, are going to come pouring down out of the Alpine passes, and then what are we going to do? Defeat them in battle? I don't think so. Accounts differ as to the fate of Quintillus, that is, whether he was killed by his own troops or committed suicide, but they don't differ in having him dead as a doornail when Aurelian arrived in Italy. The troops Quintillus had gathered, needless to say, swore allegiance to Aurelian the first chance they got. As with everything else to do with the 3rd century, the chronology of Aurelian's reign is very confused, and though we know the things that he did, we cannot hope to know exactly the order in which he did them. Right off the bat, though, it seems that he headed back to the Balkans, because the Vandals had taken his withdrawal of the legions as an open invitation to attack. The Vandals already posed enough of a threat that they were next up on Claudius's hit list when he died, and the disappearance of the Imperial army only inflamed their passions, and before you could say the Emperor is dead, long live the Emperor, the Vandals were running amok in Pannonia. So after making sure Quintillus was dead and the troops in Italy were with him, Aurelian immediately charged back to the Balkans to push back the invading tribes. Aurelian's strategy for dealing with the Vandals was to order that anything that could be consumed by men and horse be drawn inside the towns and cities of the provinces to leave the invading Vandals without anything to eat. Once the lack of provisions began to drag the Vandals down, Aurelian swept in and crushed them in a quick battle. When the fighting was done, Aurelian allowed the remaining Vandals to return home, but with the stipulation that they hand over 2,000 cavalrymen to serve in the Roman army. With internal recruitment often coming up dry as a result of 20 years of famine, plague, and warfare, Aurelian knew that fresh recruits for his army were going to have to come from somewhere if he planned to reunify the empire, and the German tribes began to look like an excellent source of soldiers. The Vandal horsemen would not be the last, or even the largest levy Aurelian would lay on defeated northern tribes, and it was during his reign that the so-called Germanization of the legions, already underway in the form of temporary auxiliaries and sometime mercenaries, would really begin in earnest. On an ad hoc basis, the Empire had always been able to get tribes from beyond the frontiers to fight for them, going back as far as Julius Caesar, but the process was about to become far more systematized and far more permanent. While he was overseeing the Vandal retreat, though, word came that the Alemanni, or likely just the Juthungi, one of their component tribes, was headed into Italy, the 3rd time now in just over 10 years that barbarians had set foot on the once perfectly safe peninsula of Italy. Leaving behind enough troops to remind the Vandals of their oath, Aurelian headed back to Italy, a trip that was becoming a nearly annual pilgrimage for the men of the Danube legions. When they reached the peninsula, Aurelian found that the Juthungi had overrun the Po Valley, sacked a number of towns, and were presently occupying the key city of Placentia. Aurelian made straight for the city, but in his haste to meet the enemy, he never gave his men time to rest, and when they finally arrived at Placentia, the legionaries were exhausted. Well, actually, that's not true. They never even had set an ambush for the Romans, and right at sunset, the weary legions were ready to make camp and go to bed. But the Germans sprang out of the woods and put Aurelian and his army to a humiliating flight. Scattered and disoriented, it took some time to piece the legions back together, and in the meantime, the Juthungi pointed themselves south, aiming directly for Rome, which understandably put the Romans into a panic. The ambush at Placentia, though, was by no means a decisive victory for the Juthungi. and the embarrassment it caused Aurelian only ratcheted up his motivation to stop them. He regrouped his forces and gave chase, this time keeping a close eye on the Jethungai's movements and waiting for the right moment to strike. He found his moment on the banks of the Metaurus River, where he broadsided the Germans and ran them into the water, which swept a good number of them down to a watery grave. The battered Jethungai sent word to the Emperor that they would like to parley for peace and safe passage home, but their attitude was not sufficiently deferential for Aurelian, and he rejected their entreaties. Without a guarantee of safe passage, the Germans were forced to head north, with Aurelian's army shadowing their movements and waiting again for the perfect opportunity to smash them up for good. This time, the opportunity came at Pava, where Aurelian forced the fleeing Jethungai into a pitched battle that they had no hope of winning. Completely defeated, the remaining Germans surrendered their captured booty and begged for mercy, which this time Aurelian allowed, if they gave their fighting men over to the legions. If they wanted to live, they'd have to fight for the Empire, not against it. Some reports have this new influx of soldiers coming in at anywhere between 20 and 40.
The following episode of How Did This Get Made is sponsored by LegalZoom.
Thousand men. This was not small potatoes to an imperial army badly weakened by the previous generation's strife. With the frontiers finally quieted down and Italy free of invaders, Aurelian was finally able to make his triumphal entry into Rome in early 271, almost a year into his reign. Sporting the new title Germanicus Maximus for his recent victories, it is likely that Aurelian was expecting, if not enthusiastic greetings from the citizens of Rome, then at least a warm embrace. But Aurelian's entry into the city seems to have actually sparked riots and street fighting, not seen since the days of the Flavian capture of Rome, some 200 years before. The causes for this mass uprising were threefold. First, there was the lingering effects of the panic caused by Aurelian's defeat at Placentia, which had everyone's nerves good and frayed. Second, was the disruption of the grain supply, which likely had been caused by Zenobia's capture of Egypt. And third, we have the massive fraud being undertaken daily at the main imperial mint in Rome, which is the reason the riots got started in the first place. As I mentioned a few episodes back, debasement of the coinage was a major problem for the Roman economy, and the damage done by official imperial policy was being hugely exacerbated by the conduct of the workers at the mint when it came time to actually produce the debased coins. Even the nominal amount of silver that was supposed to be going into the coins was having a hard time finding its way into circulation, and instead kept getting routed into the pockets of the workers and administrators of the mint, and, of course, the pockets of any official tasked with overseeing the process. Aurelian had already signaled that he planned to revalue the coins back up to a respectable level, respectable for the times being 5% silver in the denarius, and the mint workers were justifiably worried that when Aurelian found out that their additional graft was making things even worse than he thought, that he would be, well, displeased. And given Aurelian's fearsome reputation, displeased meant that heads were likely to roll, literally. So when Aurelian arrived in Rome, the mint workers took to the streets and began demonstrating against the new regime. Soon enough, they had ginned up their narrowly selfish cause into a general strike, and full-blown street riots broke out, egged on by senators and equites who had backed Quintillus and who hoped to drive Aurelian out of power before he had a chance to do any damage to their interests. Angry at the sedition and unwavering in his commitment to putting down the mob, Aurelian called in regular troops to back up the urban cohorts who were clashing daily. Thousands were dying on both sides, but pretty soon, order was restored as the overmatched civilians were driven back into their homes. When the full story of how the mint riots got started came out, the citizens of Rome found Aurelian had passed well beyond displeased. A quick and ruthless purge followed that took the lives not just of the mint administrators, but also the senators and equites who had supported first their fraud and then their riots. When Aurelian's harsh justice was done being metered out, the emperor